What is being opposed through global justice movement advocacy? Is there only one voice in the global justice movement? By Emil, Stenberg, Ed Williams and George Perry. The order of the question has been swapped, as we believe the global justice movement has more than one voice as a result of it being opposed to many different things, but still unified in its opposition to neoliberal globalization. This is demonstrated throughout the presentation.
The global justice movement, or the GJM for short, is a political and social movement that opposes the current form of neoliberal globalization. Most literature puts this movement's starting date somewhere in the 1990s. It came together beginning in the 90s to protest various intergovernmental organizational meetings and consisted of various NGOs, independent activists, and advocacy networks. Both the methodology and variety in the movement demonstrates its unity and complexity. This variety has been evident in both the World Social Forum and the Battle in Seattle, showing that the GJM consists of multiple voices, but is nonetheless unified by its commitment to alter globalization. The extent to which NGOs are involved neither detracts nor enhances the unity of the movement, rather the movement to be more varied. The global justice movement, as explained by the discourses surrounding it, began with either the protests against the G7 summit in Birmingham in 1998 or the protests against the World Trade Organization Seattle round of negotiations in 1999. The difficulty of pinpointing its creation as a movement signifies the complex nature of the movement. In other words, the movement is as ever-changing and expansive as to make classification notoriously difficult. The movement is characterized by many scholars as a loose network of individuals, actors, and organizations that cooperate, participate, debate, and engage in both advocacy and direct action. There's a great variety in how various actors operate, and in that some will specifically focus on advocacy as close to institutions as possible, while others will work as close to the grassroots as possible. Originally, the movement focused on issues of free trade and its associated harmful effects. However, this developed into actors focusing on issues such as debt relief, ending poverty, increased financial regulation, fair trade, labor rights, environmental regulations, and institutional reform. This richness in causes has made the movement into a movement that is increasingly inclusive and increasingly ideologically diverse. The movement is often characterized as being formed by autonomous groups that organize horizontally and support the principles of direct democracy. Through this, they essentially challenge traditional notions of Western governance and capitalism, as they are informal groupings based on the principle of self-organization.
Soft power was a term that was coined in the 1980s by Nye and is defined as the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. It is the use of more grassroots approaches to justice, and by changing the general conversation of the public, changes can then be made higher up. It is often seen as more radical and activist, but that is not necessarily the case. An example of soft power associated with the GJM is the use of Calgary dollars in Canada, is a currency used to barter and trade between individuals circumventing the national currency. Hard power involves more direct approaches to changing government policy and is seen as more legitimate, despite its sometimes undemocratic nature, particularly in terms of lobbying. There is also a point to which it can be suggested that NGOs that use this level of power also have a level of money and thus an ability to influence the media and public, in much the same way as soft power aims to. An example of an NGO that identifies with the GJM but uses hard power to get their aims is Community Renaissance. They use petitions aimed at the Canadian bank and government to try and obtain interest-free grants to improve infrastructure and boost the economy in a real way. Smart power is the combined use of hard and soft power. This is one of the factors that leads to the success of the GJM. Our case studies show that the GJM uses soft and hard power together effectively in its more organised and less organised activities and branches. The difference between each of the organisations that fall under the GJM might prove to be a very powerful asset, as the change in size and power allows the GJM to broaden its ability to influence policy and the general conversation. As demonstrated by the two case studies later on, the GJM utilises the combination of hard and soft power to be more effective in its activities. The GJM opposes the social, political, economic and environmental implications of neoliberalised globalisation. However, it does not oppose the notion of globalisation, as it is the bedrock of the movement's global inclusivity. Without globalization, the movement would not necessarily have the capabilities to organize and adapt with the flexibility and speed that is required to affect issues. It opposes the democratic deficit primarily within institutions and governments that leads to the various issues that the actors within the movement focus on. This is essentially what the collective identity of the movement associates with. However, there can be no objective explanation of the identity. Having no introspective writings from the global justice movement, the image and identity that have been created are only from the scholars and media that have written about it. Moreover, as there are many different actors, there is no one clear identity within the movement. Many of the identities under this term can be conflicting and contradictory, but still come together under the one heading of GJM. There is no one identity across the broad spectrum of those involved. For example, when the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act in 1994 passed, members of society from all walks of life joined under one idea to protest against the injustice of the fine print within, particularly on the right to play music in public areas, and as a result, a large section of the rave community became involved. This is an example of how the identity of the individual does not change the power to participate in a larger body of organisations and people under one heading. The differences within have created the diverse outputs of the GJM. Within the global justice movement, there are numerous different NGOs who fall under this umbrella term. By its very definition, the global movement will inevitably encompass many different groups and opinions, but with one main goal uniting them all. Having numerous voices does not necessarily detract from the legitimacy of the movement. Varying levels of internal democracy within the groups could create problems when trying to organise mass protests or movement, but as we will see in the case studies, there are still mass movements that still take place, some of which could be said to be very effective in bringing these issues to the attention of the masses and the institutions involved. Combs et al. Suggests that global justice networks are simply convergent spaces in which these numerous groups can come together and move forward. The internet has also become very important to the changing and expanding nature of the global justice movement, as it allows connections between the groups to take place from all over the world. Langman discusses the idea of how information can move freely across different networks to allow broad exchanges between large numbers of actors. As Saunders points out, beautiful decision-making involves broad participation, and this allows the GJM to be a broad, somewhat democratic organisation.
The GJM has been widely criticised for being opposed to globalisation as a concept, or anti-globalisation. However, this is not the case. They advocate a better form of globalisation, or are ultra-globalisation. Seeger and Wilson evaluated the ideas and beliefs of the GJM and found that there is coherence among the GJM on core concepts and claims. They conclude that the GJM shows ideological coherence and should be considered an alter-ideology, not an anti-ideology. However, this research was conducted purely using data on organisations connected to the GJM, and thus totally ignores the informal, unorganised part of the GJM, which is where most of the ideological and operational differences between the two different currents of activity lie. However, as we will argue, the GJM are united in their opposition to the current form of globalisation. We believe this gives the GJM coherence as a movement. The GJM is founded upon an opposition to the current form of globalisation. This criterion is very narrow, which means its members vary greatly in their beliefs and ideologies, even in response to the issues with the system and how it should be changed. The concept of the GJM provides convergent space for similarly minded members of civil society to discuss, share, and join together. This can happen formally, for example, the World Social Forum, believed to be the largest meeting of global civil society, as well as informally. Events such as the battle in Seattle, the most significant protests the GJM have been involved in. Many of the criticisms of the GJM, as shown in the case studies, are in relation to the multitude of voices within the movement and the lack of unity and cohesion between them. However, these criticisms are unfounded, as the movement was not created as a unified body of individuals and organisations striving for the same goal, but a label given to those in opposition of the same thing. It is in its nature to be diverse and contain many, sometimes conflicting voices. We will use two case studies to demonstrate the theories we have outlined. Our first case study is the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum is a meeting of global civil society which provides an arena for movements to meet and discuss struggles, strategies and networks. It is an open space for the free exchange of ideas, experiences, and struggles. The World Social Forum has brought together two currents of activity: the direct action movement involved in mass demonstrations against globalization, and the worldwide civil society, which is mainly embodied by NGOs. The World Social Forum is a key site for the GJM, generally accepted to be the epicenter of the GJM intellectually and organisationally. Participation has reached over 100,000 people, with groups and people from all around the world attending. No other global justice coalition comes close to the geographical, ethnic, or linguistic diversity of the World Social Forum. Due to its formal and organised nature, the World Social Forum draws in a large proportion of NGOs and NGO representatives, as well as trade unions and social movement organisations seeking real progression in the struggle against globalisation. The World Social Forum Charter was created at the first meeting of the World Social Forum in 2001, held in Brazil. It set out the principles which the World Social Forum stands for and are to be respected by all wishing to take part. The first principles outline the free and open nature of the forum, allowing all groups and movements of civil society that oppose to neoliberalism to be a part of the World Social Forum. It welcomes individuals and NGOs alike. However, from 2002 to 2006, NGOs and international NGOs were very active in the World Social Forum, leading up to the 2007 forum in Nairobi, where NGOs dominated. The logistical organisation and themes of the 2007 forum demonstrate this heavy NGO presence. The workshops and panels at this forum were organised and funded by NGOs, less representation of grassroots movements. There was a focus on international development and organisations, and less concern for local issues. This receives a large amount of criticism from organisers and participants alike. The Nairobi Forum marked the beginning of the decline of NGO participation in the World Social Forum. This demonstrates the many voices contained within the GJM. However, they are mainly divided by style rather than by substance.
Our second case study is the battle in Seattle. The global justice movement was clearly seen during the famous or infamous battle in Seattle in 1999. The protests took place from late November to early December in Seattle, Washington. It began with small protests by a very varied mixture of GJM activists. The protests in Seattle gained traction relatively quickly, as originally there were a small number of independent activists protesting the World Trade Organization meetings taking place. The activists were soon joined by 500 to 700 non-governmental organizations. The NGOs involved included the AFL-CIO, an American labor union, the Kalahari Conservation Society, and the World Rainforest Movement. The independent activists and groups were organized into three main coalitions, with various small subsidiary and independent coalitions on the side. So the three main coalitions were the People for Fair Trade, the network opposed to the WTO, the Direct Action Network, and the AFL-CIO. The unified protest gathered as many as 50,000 protesters and demonstrators. The massively varied gathering of activists, groups, and NGOs demonstrates the notion that the GJM consists of many different voices. So the Seattle protests were united by the common goal of publicizing the undesirable aspects of the WTO and rage against the neoliberalization of globalization. Together, they mobilized around the values of alter globalization. There were multiple interests, identities, resources, and networks as a result of the variation, which allowed for such large-scale mobilization, resulting in a movement with many voices. While they all had varied interests with regards to neoliberal globalization and the WTO, such as the AFL-CIO pursuing labor rights, while the Kalahari Conservation Society focusing more on environmental issues. The groups and NGOs grouped together under an umbrella cause rather than splitting into smaller protests. This constant networking reinforced the collective identity and promoted more open activity than policy discussion. Furthermore, there were varied methods within the groupings and coalitions. The Direct Action Network used more direct action methods, such as sit-ins. The People for Fair Trade used similar methods, while the AFL-CIO used more traditional union methods of striking and marching. There were also multiple incidents of anarchist groups and individuals looting large corporate stores in protest of corporations. The variation in methods further demonstrates the multitude of voices within the GJM in Seattle in 1999. While this is not necessarily representative of the entire movement, Seattle is an important look at how the movement has operated in the past. Specifically, it gives insight into the unity and variety of the movement, as demonstrated by the slogan, "Turtles and Teamsters united at last," present at the protests. The protests were more NGO light than NGO heavy, because NGOs were not specifically involved to the extent that they might be at an organized meeting. This is largely influenced by the method used by the GJM. The protests in Seattle utilized civil disobedience and marching, which can be called soft power. There were many NGOs, such as the AFL-CIO, involved in the protests. However, they were not given the opportunity to take hard power approaches, such as diplomacy and lobbying, as present at the World Social Forum. Furthermore, the involvement of so many independent activists and groups meant that there was no distinct hierarchy of leadership, and so was more activist-based. The use of soft power allows for a more varied protest movement because it means that NGOs are not dominating the discourses, nor dominating the associational networks. It helps to reinforce the multiplicity of voices. However, an NGO-heavy approach does not detract from the plurality of the movement. It simply alters certain processes. The NGO-light aspect of the protests in Seattle has the side effect of making literary discourses try to label the grouping of activists and groups in other ways. So the splitting of the movement into constituent parts naturally violates the spirit of the movement, because there was a unifying cause. The scholar Ethel Solingen attempted to split the protests into smaller parts, separated by interests, specifically NGOs, which is certainly correct. However, it means that the protests are viewed by their parts rather than the sum of their parts. An effective way of describing the movement is as a postmodern transnational political party that is one with no clear leadership structure. This is because it allows the movement to be labeled as one with a unifying cause that extends past national borders and focuses on issues of globalization. The variety within the protests demonstrates how improper the method of separation of the protests is. The protests brought together many opposing views under a unified banner, which means that even if the protesting groups can be split into their constituent parts, it does very little to explain how the movement came together as a whole. To conclude, the global justice movement consists of a multitude of voices operating together to combat neoliberal globalization. It focuses on alter globalization to fundamentally change the nature of globalization. The sheer variety of groups, NGOs, and actors functioning in various ways demonstrates that the movement has many voices and is not dictated by the labels placed on it. Both the World Social Forum and the battle in Seattle exemplify this unity of voices. Furthermore, the unity remained consistent regardless of the level of involvement of NGOs.